Hi, my name is Will, and this is Dyslexia Tutoring. Now, I would like to help parents understand how it is that they can best help their kids learn how to read successfully so we don't have reading failure. And one way that makes it kind of easier to understand is if we look at national trends and what works and what doesn't work. So I've prepared a little presentation, and the title is Reading Success versus Reading Failure, the Role of Dyslexia. Only 10 to 20% of students are dyslexic, so why are 68% failing to learn how to read? If we look at these broad national trends, we can understand and look at the outliers that contradict these trends. We might be able to understand something about how best we can help our own children individually and maybe light a fire to make some change in our local districts and otherwise. So, the context, according to the NAEP, only 32% of American students are proficient at reading. And it seems to be somewhat geographical. Like, for example, the light blue states are the states that are below average. So, significantly below 32% of their students are proficient at reading. If we look at the light blue, though, it's about average, where about 32% of students are proficient at reading. And then the dark blue is where we're slightly above average, where slightly more than average number of kids are learning how to read. So that might be 40 to 50%. All right, those numbers, by the way, are not acceptable. They're atrocious. And so one aspect of this we might think about is dyslexia. Is dyslexia a major cause of our reading failure in the United States? So first thing is that we have about 10 to 20% of students are estimated to have dyslexia. These come from pretty reputable sources. Um, but there's a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding about dyslexia. It's a very complex topic. And just to start out, before I give definitions for what dyslexia is, I want to talk a little bit about what it's not. So, for example, having dyslexia doesn't mean you have low intelligence. It affects 15% of the population. It's somewhat hereditary. And also, students with dyslexia can learn how to read. All right, so now what is dyslexia and what isn't dyslexia? Number one thing, when I talk to teachers who work within literacy, oftentimes they believe that dyslexia is just a tendency to see letters backwards or jumbled. And it's not that. It's not a visual impairment. Dyslexia looks exactly the same as laziness, oftentimes, and it's tragic. So, a lot of students who are struggling reading, you can't see why it is that they're struggling, and their reluctance to want to do reading practices and things looks exactly like reversion, like they hate it, they don't want to learn. So, it looks like laziness, and it's not that. It's not a result of insufficient practice. In fact, practicing too much in the wrong way for these students will cause the dyslexia, will cause the reading disabilities to get worse. So it's not a result of insufficient practice. These kids can work their heads off and come to terrible results. Again, not an indicator of low IQ. In my experience, sometimes kids with really high IQs are more likely, or they get worse cases of reading disabilities because of their intelligence. Um, So it's definitely not an indicator of low IQ. It's not caused by improper fonts. You're not going to cure dyslexia by using Arial font or some other thing. In fact, when you jumble up fonts, it tends to be something good for kids to work through their reading disability. It's not a stage of development that one outgrows. One of the big problems with dyslexia and with reading disabilities is the inability for people in literacy to catch it. It's an invisible problem. So students in kindergarten, first and second grade will often do really well in reading. They'll read quickly, and the teachers will have no concern at all about what they're able to do. And it's not till third or fourth grade that they realize that this kid has major reading issues. And why that is something I could talk about in another video. And it's not primarily boys. Dyslexia affects boys and girls equally. I was under the impression that mostly boys got it. I read that book, Why Johnny Can't Read, 1955, and you know it tends to be that boys are more noticeable because their behaviors tend to be more extreme when they're not reading well and they act out in other ways or they get bored in class. And so it is more evident when boys are struggling with reading. When girls do, they struggle in a different way oftentimes. All right, so now let's define dyslexia. Not what it isn't, but what it is. And I'm going to give two different definitions here. I'm going to give a broad definition, and I'm going to give a narrow definition. And I want to think about these two things as we go forward because it's going to help us understand the situation of what dyslexia is. And so, the broad definition by Dr. David Kilpatrick: dyslexia is poor word level reading despite adequate effort and opportunity. This says that when a student has trouble reading, essentially, if they've been given time, so say by the time you get to second or third grade and you're struggling with reading, that is dyslexia. Any student who's not reading proficiently is dyslexic. It doesn't matter the origin of what dyslexia is, it's a problem and it needs to be fixed. All right. Now, this is a useful definition because it doesn't get into the weeds of exactly what's going on neurologically with a student that causes them to have dyslexia. In fact, Dr. David Kilpatrick and others within the science of reading discipline, the science of reading is a massive discipline between psychologists and linguists and educators to find out what reading is and why it is that certain kids can do it and why certain kids can't. And they use all their different disciplinary, wisdom to figure it out. And they've come to a pretty good idea of what dyslexia is. But more importantly, what is reading failure? Okay, so by Kilpatrick's definition, you can just say that any kid who doesn't read well is dyslexic. Enough said. All right. The narrow definition, and this is Sally Shaywitz and her husband Shaywitz. This is the technical definition that you'll find in official documents in education and in law. Now that dyslexia is recognized as a specific learning disability, it's become a legally protected, like a medical condition. So this is the narrow definition. Dyslexia is a specific learning disability that is neurobiological in origin. As I go through this narrow definition, I'm going to break it down a little bit. So neurobiological in origin, it means you're born with it and it has something to do with the brain. And it also tends to be that it runs in families. So if one person in the family has it, it's likely that you'll see more than one person in that family have it. It is characterized by difficulties with accurate and or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. So fluent word recognition is when you have a good reader, it tends to be that they see words and they read them automatically. It comes to them. With kids who are good readers, if they see a word one or two times, it gets orthographically mapped into their minds, and then essentially they know that word, and whenever they see it, they can't help but to read it. They can't help but to know what the word is. Poor decoding. Oh, with kids with dyslexia, with some profiles of dyslexia, students might need to see a word 15, 20, 35 times. They need to be explicitly taught this word 15 to 30 times in order for them to start recognizing the word. Not all students with dyslexia have this, but it is very common. Decoding abilities. This is the ability to take the letters of a word, like in the word, say, slap, 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 and then recognize what those sounds are and be able to say them in order. So that's decoding, essentially breaking down the words and sounding it out. These difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of language. This is the most important part and the hardest part to understand, that these difficulties typically result, so this is the most common cause of it. They result from a deficit in the phonological component of language. Phonology has to do with sounds, and as opposed to phonetics, which is knowing each individual sound, phonology is knowing how sounds work within an environment. And so, for example, the quickest example I can give of a phonological deficit is with high school students I have who are dyslexic or who are dyslexic. Essentially, I ask them the following question. I give them the following task. I say crimp, crimp. Say crimp, but instead of say s. If the student says crisp, automatically, without thinking, that student does not have deficits in phonological awareness. They've just performed a task that is really complex, and they did it automatically. Now, with a student with dyslexia, if I ask that same question, say crimp, crimp, now say crimp, but instead of say s. Oftentimes I'll get the answer, I don't understand. All right, which is kind of an interesting way. I can give them examples, but they still don't understand. And if I give them long enough, they will not come to the right answer. They will think about it, and I might get an answer like crop, And so there's something going on where they have real difficulty with isolating certain sounds within a word and then being able to manipulate those sounds, which is one of the conditions of kids who read well, is they can just do that automatically. Okay. The These difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of language that is often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities. Essentially, this happens with kids who are really bright and kids who are not so bright, but it happens equally with kids. That doesn't it's not contingent upon IQ. Okay, really bright kids have this, and other ones don't. And the provision of effective classroom instruction. I think this is actually the also most important thing to look at this. Not because I agree with it. I think Sally Shaywitz is incredible. I think her book, Overcoming Dyslexia, is fantastic and everybody should read it. But I really think there's a problem with this part. The provision of effective classroom instruction. That's to say, if kids receive the same classroom instruction that works for everybody else and it doesn't work for them, then it's unexpected that this would happen. Okay? But again, look at the fact that 68% of kids in America don't read proficiently. All right, this is why is it the 68%? If 20%, if we even say 20% are dyslexic, why is it that 68% don't read well? All right, are we talking about proficient instruction? Are we talking about effective classroom instruction? And that's what we'll get into. So again, Shaywitz is great, but I think this part here is a loaded term. If the student receives effective classroom instruction, would a dyslexic kid still develop reading disabilities? That's a question we'll look at. Secondary consequences may include problems in reading comprehension and reduced reading experience that can impede growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. So these are consequences. Kids who don't read well, they tend to fall behind in school, both in content and in meta knowledge. Okay, so this is distinct. This is a result. You have certain kids that if you tell them a story, well, for most kids, if you tell them a story and then you ask them questions about it, they're generally able to answer the questions. Like you tell the tale of Snow White. Why did Snow White fall asleep? I don't know. The witch gave her an apple and she fell asleep. All right. They understand that. Now, a kid who can't do that, that might be a language processing disorder, and that's distinct from dyslexia. Dyslexia is an inability to read, not to understand things. And so, yeah, let's move on. So now we have our broad. Dyslexia is the condition that a kid fails to learn how to read and struggles in reading. Narrow definition, all these things. Neurobiological in origin, difficulty in fluent word recognition, spelling, decoding. It's phonological in nature, and it doesn't discriminate between IQs. And then the troublesome part is the provision. It happens despite effective classroom instruction. So let's talk about what is reading success. All right, generally you would say that reading success is when a student can pick up a book and they can read it. They can, within their domain of knowledge, they're able to figure out what the words are. Even words that they don't know, oftentimes they have them in the recesses of their mind, so they can sound out a word like economics as opposed to economics. One of them just sounds right to them because they've heard that word before. All right, so reading success is basically being able to pick up a book and be able to get all the information out of it that you're developmentally capable of doing. That's reading success. What is reading failure? Well, reading failure is the inability to do that. And so when a kid picks up a book and they read in a way that is not accurate, so they mess up a lot of words. They read the wrong words in the wrong places. They're not able to understand what they're reading because of the amount of difficulty it takes for them to actually decode, to break down the words and to be able to read fluently. They can't read fluently, so as their mind is grasping with trying to break down the words, figure out what the words are, they lose the whole comprehensive aspect of reading. You're reading to understand. And so this really comes down to, in primary education, you have two different levels of reading. The first one is learning to read. Children start out, the first job in kindergarten, first, second grade, third grade is to learn to read. Figure out all the things that require you to be a competent reader. After that, you have in the end of third grade into the fourth grade, you switch over to reading to learn. Now you're going to start reading so that you can learn new facts. You can start reading to develop your mind. All right. So when you get to reading to learn, that's when a lot of these kids who the careful curricula that's picked out so that they can develop and learn how to read, it's only evident when you get to the reading to learn part that these kids are actually struggling with reading because now they're taken out of their domain of competence. They're taken out of their domain of familiarity, and now they're introduced to words that they don't know. Instead of being stuck to 900 words in the Dolch list or the Fry list, all the texts that they read are comprised of those words. Now you're getting outside of that domain and you're starting to read complex texts. And when students fail at this, it becomes evident that they actually don't know how to read, or they can't read, or that they're disabled in some way. And so let's look at what reading success looks like. Again, reading success can happen for both kids who have dyslexia and kids who don't have dyslexia. All right, kids with dyslexia can learn how to read in a way that they read just as well as anybody else. Sometimes a little less well, but generally proficiently and well above the average of what we're looking at nationwide. So dyslexia does not stop a person from being able to learn how to read. That's a myth. They can learn how to read, and they can learn how to read well. Conversely, reading failure, when you have kids who are neurotypical, they can fail to learn how to read. And of course, we see that with the 68% of kids who fail to learn how to read. We have reading failure. What Dr. Kilpatrick would say, we have 68% dyslexia, essentially, that needs to be fixed. And so reading failure looks like a kid who doesn't have dyslexia, but reads in the same way that a dyslexic person struggles to read. All right. So let's look at this. Reading success. For a neurotypical student, reading success could be reached through appropriate instruction. All right, if they're given appropriate instruction, they will learn how to read, or in fact, they can learn in spite of inappropriate instruction. We'll look later. Some of the National Reading Panel of 2000 said that about 30% of kids will learn to read regardless of how you teach them. They'll kind of just teach themselves as long as they're given some kind of instruction. There's something about these kids because they're neurotypical and they have maybe some gifts phonologically that they're able to notice some things, and then they notice those patterns and then they teach themselves to read. All right. So reading success for neurotypical, either appropriate instruction or through self-teaching, essentially, in spite of their instructor. Dyslexic kids, reading success can only be reached through appropriate instruction. They need to be given the instruction in a way that works. Okay, they don't have the capabilities because of their phonological impairments to be able to work it out themselves. They need explicit instruction, and we'll get to what that looks like later. Reading failure for a neurotypical kid through inappropriate instruction, and then this inappropriate instruction encourages them or allows them to develop entrenched compensatory strategies. Okay. So when a student is failing to read, he might look at a word and he doesn't know the word, and he'll just guess a word. He'll say, well, it seems like it might be this. In fact, I'll give you my story. The first time I noticed this, I had a kid. His parents said he was struggling with reading, and so I had him read for me. He pulls out his book, and there's a little picture of a kid getting ready to go outside. He's putting on his coat. And then you read, and he read the first line. It says, Tom was cold, so he put on his jacket. I said, what's that last word? He said, oh, it's jacket. I was like, oh, can you spell that word for me, like as it's written there? He said, C-O-A-T. I was like, does that word say jacket? He said, no, but I don't know what it is, and I think it's jacket because, I look at the picture and then, it makes sense. And also my teacher told me that if it makes sense, that's just as good as if I, knew the word that was actually written. And so imagine this kid's been practicing. This is a really bright kid, by the way, but he's been practicing this method of guessing when he doesn't know a word. It becomes entrenched in his mind, and it becomes his primary way of dealing with unknown words, because the kid obviously didn't know how to decode, because coat is a regular word. The C followed by O always says k, and OA always says O, regularly, and then T says t, coat. There's no way, or there's no reason you couldn't decode that word if you had even the basics of phonics. And so that's an entrenched compensatory strategy. Now, in that case, I don't know if he was dyslexic or if he was neurotypical, but given instruction to read in a way that dyslexics often do because they have trouble um, decoding words. All right. So, neurotypical reading failure can be just as devastating as dyslexic reading failure. Dyslexic gets reading failure through inappropriate instruction, develops entrenched compensatory strategies. So this is essentially the same thing. Both of the students get inappropriate instruction, and because of that, they practice inappropriate methods of dealing with words, and they get these entrenched compensatory strategies, an entrenched neurologically, entrenched way of perceiving words in text. So, neurotypical kids sometimes learn in spite of faulty instruction. That doesn't mean neurotypical kids will always do it. Many neurotypical kids will fail and develop those entrenched compensatory strategies. Dyslexic kids cannot teach themselves. They need appropriate instruction. All right, so let's look at the NRP. The NRP is kind of the crowning achievement of the science of reading. It was the biggest study ever done on reading back in 2000. And according to the NRP, the consensus was that 95 to 99% of kids can learn to read with appropriate instruction. Furthermore, around 30% can learn to read regardless of instruction. 65% of kids, that's neurotypical and dyslexic, need appropriate instruction. Now, Siegfried Engelmann, who is kind of one of the guiding lights of the science of reading, said virtually all children can learn to read with the right instruction. And Louisa Moats, another big name within the science of reading. Researchers now estimate that 95% of all children can be taught to read by the end of first grade, with future achievement constrained only by students' reasoning and listening comprehension abilities. All right, by the end of first grade, we can teach 95% of kids how to read. And I think that 95% might mean as well that by third grade, that you're going to get like 99%. And is it possible to get 100%? Let's look at Steubenville, Ohio. One thing that's interesting is that we will always hear about in the news or newspapers failures within public education or in education in general. We might hear that many kids are being failed, okay, and why it is. And often it's said that students, school districts don't have enough money, that if they just had more money, they'd be able to succeed. Um, Steubenville, Ohio. One thing about reading trends within nationwide is that there are socioeconomic factors tend to accurately reflect reading proficiency. That is, wealthy kids tend to score higher on reading proficiency tests. Poor kids tend to score lower on reading proficiency tests. If you go within poor districts, they tend to have lower scores. If you go within wealthy districts, they tend to have higher scores. Now, the school district in Steubenville, Ohio, with around 2,400 kids, is one of the poorest school districts in the nation. Not just in Ohio, but in the nation. And despite this, it has achieved between 93% and 100% reading proficiency for third graders every year over the last 20 years. This is not a fluke. This has been happening for 20 years. And that 100% proficiency was recently, I think in the last year or two, that they had 100% proficiency based on state standardized tests, where here are the rates of proficiency in the state of Ohio. Each one of these dots up here, this is 100% proficiency. So it looks like there's one school here that has 100% proficiency. If I just use my little arrow here. And then on the x-axis here, so on the y-axis you have proficiency from 20% to 100%. And then on the x-axis you have poverty levels. Okay, so here you have 60% of families are below the poverty line in these school districts. This one has 30% reading proficiency. This one has like 40. This one has 50. But if you look way up here, all the way in the poor, 40% of families are in below the poverty line here. You get Steubenville, Ohio, which has, again, over the last 20 years, got between 93 and 100% reading proficiency scores for third graders. That does not track. And so, what is it they're doing? Are you going to look at this and say there's something in the water in Steubenville that prevents kids from failing to learn how to read? Or is it possible that maybe Steubenville is doing something that other schools are not? Or maybe something that only the rich districts are doing, or maybe the private schools? Because it tends to be people would say, oh, if you get those kind of results, maybe you're at a private school and they get to pick and choose their students, which private schools can push out the kids with low IQ, whatever. They have high school entrance exams, things like that. But Steubenville doesn't have that. It's a public school. Everybody goes there. And again, among the poorest school districts in the nation. So let's look at the math real quick. 32% of American kids read proficiently. 68% of American kids do not. It's estimated that between 15 and 20% of American kids are dyslexic. So what accounts for the discrepancy between dyslexia and reading failure? What is it that we have 20%, say, kids dyslexic, and that eats up so that there's about 48% left unaccounted for? 48% of neurotypical kids are failing to learn how to read. What accounts for that? And if Steubenville has reached 100% proficiency, how do we account for dyslexia and other reading failures there? How do we account for the fact that they have, say, 15 to 20% of their kids are dyslexic? Why is it that they're getting 98 to 100% reading proficiency scores, even 93, which is pretty astounding for a public school? So how do we account for dyslexia and other reading failures? Well, again, dyslexic kids can learn how to read. And let's take a look at the science of reading. What is appropriate instruction, which I brought up a bunch of times. We don't have time to talk exactly about what it is today, but one is that what Steubenville does is they have appropriate instruction, and we'll look at the features of that a little bit. But also they have screening diagnostics to make sure that kids who are susceptible, that possibly have dyslexia, that they get a little extra attention to make sure that they get remediated to a level so that they can benefit from appropriate reading instruction. Because they have to be neurologically at a level phonologically that they can understand appropriate instruction. All right, that's the big difference between dyslexic kids. But the thing is, that doesn't take a whole lot of time or effort to be able to do it. And kids who are neurotypical also benefit from the same kind of instruction that dyslexics get to get them ready for instruction. So there's actually no reason not to do dyslexic instruction with everybody. It's not different, it's just there's a little bit more in the beginning, which benefits everybody who does it. All right. So Scarborough's reading rope, he's basically saying that these are how reading happens. This is what reading success looks like. This is fluent reading. So there's two different strands here, and on the top strand you get basically language stuff. Does the kid have normal language abilities? They're not a language processing disorder. Can he speak with correct grammar? Which kids, unless they have some language processing disorder, they can do that. So there's background knowledge, vocabulary, language structure, verbal reasoning, literacy knowledge. All those things are the kind of things that can you read to a kid and he'll understand what you're reading. All right. If that's the case, then okay, that side's taken care of. You don't have to worry about that. Those are all natural elements of the human mind. In fact, the human mind is made to have background knowledge, vocabulary, language structure, verbal reasoning, and literacy knowledge. Like, I guess literacy knowledge, debatably. But all those things are not foreign to the human brain. Word recognition, on the other hand, is foreign to the human brain. The human brain was not designed to read books. Okay, it wasn't designed for literacy. Literacy of the different writing types is a technology, and our brain wasn't designed for it, essentially. And so when you have on the word recognition side, this is all about text. So the essential thing is you need phonological awareness. You don't need phonological awareness to be able to talk to people. I talk to kids all the time who have phonological awareness problems, and if I say constriction, they'll say consignment. You get weird things like that. But when you have conversations with them, they don't misunderstand. They hear the words and they know what the words mean, and you can talk to them about complex subjects. But if you ask them meta questions about what they're doing when they're processing language, they can't do that. Okay, so developing phonological awareness sufficient to be able to have proper instruction. All right, decoding. Now we need the instruction. We need to teach kids what the alphabetic letters say, what sounds do they make, and in what environments, and then give them their phonics. Phonics is absolutely essential. But phonics isn't going to work if they don't have phonological awareness, if they have deficits in phonological awareness and they can't think of sounds, they can't play with sounds. So that's essential. Homeschool parents, that's especially essential that you know that. Um, a lot of homeschool parents are aware that phonics is absolutely necessary, but it's not sufficient. There is a phonological awareness component that you need to be aware of before getting into phonics. And so we'll talk about how to test for that real quick. And then sight recognition. I don't like that word. You'll hear sight words, and then again, a lot of homeschool parents know that sight words are bad. You should not teach kids to read by showing them words and saying, "What is this word?" and then guess, or showing them pictures with the word and like having them guess based on the picture. All right, words are not memorized visually. Words are not memorized visually. All right, it goes deeper than that. There has to be an association between the letters and the sounds involved. I can demonstrate that, and I will in a different place. But orthographic mapping is essentially what sight recognition means. All right, and how you train that is very important. If you start with sight words and sight recognition by visuals, you're going to have reading failure. You're gonna mess with your kid's mind. Okay, so the PASS test. PASS test is really important if you want to know, and everybody should, if you want to know if your kid is susceptible to reading disabilities, to reading failure, if your student possibly has dyslexia, you want to give them this test. If you're considering giving your kid literacy, if you're going to start teaching them the alphabet, letters, and the sounds, you're going to teach them the phonics, you need to make sure that their phonological awareness level is appropriate. And so there's a lot of different tests. They're really expensive, but I think this is actually the best test, and it is free. This guy, Dr. David Kilpatrick, he is heartbroken by the state of illiteracy in the United States, and it seems to be his personal mission to make sure that no kid fails at reading. It's preventable. It's devastating when it doesn't happen. So the PASS test, you can go online and you can get it. It's free. You can download it. You can give it to your kids. There's an instruction manual. It takes a little bit to understand how to grade it, but you'll get a pretty good idea if your kid has deficits in phonological awareness or not. And again, deficits in phonological awareness are the strongest indicator of susceptibility to reading failure. If your kid has deficits in phonological awareness, it is likely that they're going to find other means of figuring out the right answer in words and develop those compensatory strategies that will entrench in their minds. And so I just wanted to give a short demonstration of the PASS test. I'm not going to give a full one, but just an idea of what it looks like and how it's implemented. Okay, I'm not going to talk about grading, but there are 3 levels of the grading. One is incorrect. So if a student gets the question incorrect, that's like worth 0. Then there's correct answers, and the correct answers are good, and they need to be marked as correct. And then there's a higher level, which is automatic. And automaticity is the goal for all of these. If they can do it automatically, that's really good, and it means their phonological awareness for that level is developed. All right. But if they have to think about it to get the right answer, it means they have knowledge, but they need practice to make it automatic. Once it's automatic, then that's good. You can move on to the next level. And so there's many different levels of ability depending on the structure of a word. And so it's easier for me just to go through it so you can see what it looks like. So first level is syllable. All right. Now I'm just going to pretend I'm the teacher and the student here. Say bookcase. Bookcase. Say bookcase, but don't say book. Case. Automatic. Say silver. Silver. Say silver, but don't say sill. Ver. That's correct. It's not automatic. Say market. Market. Say market, but don't say mar. Cut. Market, but don't say mar. Kit. All right, so here you correct and you just give the right answer. You don't say anything else, and it's in the instructions. But if they get a wrong answer, you provide the correct answer and don't explain it. and then just move on. If you explain it too much, you'll confuse the kid, or you'll give them too much information, and it'll kind of ruin the test. You need to implement it with fidelity. Okay, so level E, say umbrella, umbrella. Say umbrella, but don't say umbrella. Say alphabet, alphabet. Say alphabet, but don't say alphabet. Say Saturday, Saturday. Say Saturday, but don't say Sat-erde. Okay, then we get to the initial phoneme or onset rhyme levels. Say feet, feet. Say feet, but don't say eat. Say tame, tame. Say tame, but don't say aim. Say guide, guide. Say guide, but instead of g, say ride. Say gum, gum. Say gum, but instead of g, say thumb. Okay, now level H, basic phoneme levels. Say sleep, sleep. Say sleep, but don't say leap. Say grew, grew. Say grew, but don't say rue. Oh, sorry. Say grew, grew. Say grew, but instead of g, say true. All right. Say flows, flows. Say flows, but instead of say close. Now, if this is very easy for you, you'd be maybe surprised to find that it's really difficult for a lot of students. In this level right here, I find that a lot of students, if I say flows, flows, say flows, but instead of say you get something like coes or crane instead of say b. They'll say bane, grew, true, grew instead of g, say two. So they're missing the complex onset. They're missing the sounds that go between them. Even sleep, say sleep, but I don't say and you hear eep. All right. So it's very common for those ones to start getting a lot of mistakes with students who have phonological awareness issues. All right. Level I, this is the last sound in a syllable, I guess. Say went, went. Say went, but don't say when. Say wheat, wheat. Say wheat, but don't say we. All right, and then advanced phoneme levels. These should be late first grade to late second grade. People who fail this generally will be, will have phonological issues. Level J, ran. Say ran, but instead of say run. Kit, kit, kit. Instead of say cut. Beak, beak. Say beak, but instead of say a, bake. Here you'll find that students get confused because oftentimes students will try to spell it out in their minds and then do it that way. So they'll try to do shortcuts. But this test is designed in order to confuse that. That's why you say words like niece, N-I-E-C-E, and then knee, K-N-E-E, because the spelling is going to confuse them. So if they're trying to spell in their minds, you get nonsensical answers that only make sense if they're trying to spell it. Or you get confusion, and then you can ask them, are you trying to spell this? And they'll say, yeah. You say, don't do that. All right. Level K. Say bread, bread. Say bread, but don't say bed. Say sneak, sneak. Say sneak, but don't say seek. Say crew, crew. Say crew, but instead of say clue. Say scale, scale. Say scale, but instead of say snail. Sneeze, sneeze. Sneeze instead of say skis. This one also very confusing. Sneeze versus skis if you're looking at the spelling or you're aware of the spelling. Level L. Say some, some. Say some, but instead of say sun. Say night, night. Say night, but instead of say nice. Level M. Ghost, ghost. Say ghost, but instead of say ghost, ghost. Say ghost, but don't say goat. Say roast, roast. Say roast, but don't say wrote. Say sift, sift. Say sift, but instead of say sipped. Trust, trust. Say trust, but instead of say trucked. Deft, deft. Say deft, but instead of say decked. All right, if they can do all those things automatically, then your kid is totally ready for phonics and for everything else that they're going to do. And unless you give them improper instruction, they will do well. Improper instruction will just have to be another day. We'll talk about that. But improper instruction, if you look at the math again, improper instruction is actually the cause of reading failure. All right. The problem with the initial narrow definition by Shaywitz is that in that narrow definition it says with proper instruction. Well, with proper instruction, all kids learn how to read, and Steubenville demonstrates that pretty well. All right, that's a whole school district, super poor, and if they can get 100%, if they can get 98%, it shows that basically there is a correct way to teach. That doesn't matter if you're dyslexic, it doesn't matter if you're neurotypical, that you can learn how to read. That there's no reason at all for the 68% of American kids who can't read, other than inappropriate instruction. All right. Well, it's not a happy thing to talk about, but there it is. Hopefully, you understand something about it. Hopefully, you don't hold it against me for being the bearer of bad news. Hopefully, if you have a kid or there's a kid in your life, get this PASS test and give it to them. Make sure that they have it. You might be surprised on what you find. And I'm again Dyslexia Tutoring. I'm Will. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please put them into the chat or into the comments section. Have a great day.